The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the stillness of the neighborhood, ripping through the calm like glass under pressure. For a single breath, everything froze. A bird startled from a nearby tree, its wings scattering the silence into chaos. A scream followed, raw, broken, the kind of sound that claws into your chest and refuses to let go. And then the sight that no parent should ever have to witness. A young girl, barely 16, crumpled to the concrete, her exam notebook slipping from her trembling hands, the pages fluttering against the stained sidewalk like fragile wings. Her mother stumbled forward, hands outstretched, but neighbors held her back, too shocked and horrified to even understand what had just unfolded. A father dropped to his knees beside his daughter, clutching her, begging her to hold on, his voice cracking as he whispered her name again and again like a prayer. And standing only feet away, holding the weapon with shaking hands and cold eyes, was the one person no one would have expected. The woman who prided herself on being the guardian of the neighborhood. A woman who demanded respect, obedience, and absolute control. Karen. But here's the part that silenced even the murmurs spreading through the crowd. This wasn't an accident, nor was it a heated moment gone wrong. No, Karen had made a choice. She had pulled the trigger over something so small, so absurd, that it seemed unreal. She shot a teenager because of the way she moved on the sidewalk. Because she believed this girl was jumping where she shouldn't. What the neighbors didn't know, what even Karen herself couldn't have imagined, was that the girl lying in her father's arms wasn't fooling around, wasn't being careless. She was in the middle of her most important test, a hospitality class exam she had dreamed about for months. Every step she had taken on that sidewalk was measured, rehearsed, purposeful. Each movement was part of a routine that meant the world to her, a chance to prove that her disability would never define her future. And now, that future was bleeding out onto the pavement. The chaos that followed spiraled into something bigger than any single family, bigger than any petty HOA dispute. Neighbors whispered behind curtains, torn between fear and outrage. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but even their arrival couldn't erase the image that had already been burned into every witness's memory. A child gunned down not by a stranger, but by the very neighbor who was supposed to protect the community. But here's where this story twists into something darker, something far more unsettling than a single act of violence. Because this wasn't just about a gun or a girl or a sidewalk. This was about power, control, about how one woman's obsession with rules spiraled so far out of control that she could justify the unthinkable. The community wanted answers, and the family wanted justice. But Karen? Karen wanted silence. She wanted everyone to believe the story she was already weaving. That the girl was reckless, that she was trespassing, that she was dangerous. Dangerous? A disabled child dangerous? It was a lie so cruel, so twisted, that it left people questioning if maybe there was more to this woman than anyone had ever dared to see. As paramedics rushed in, as the girl's body was lifted onto a stretcher, one thing became clear. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. A storm was coming, one that would tear open secrets, expose betrayals, and force an entire community to choose a side. Because this wasn't just a gunshot. It was a war cry. And in the middle of it all was a girl who only wanted to pass her class, a family desperate to protect her, and a neighbor whose hunger for power was about to destroy everything she touched. So the question lingers, heavy and unavoidable. How did it come to this? How does a sidewalk, a simple stretch of concrete, turn into the stage for a tragedy that would shake the neighborhood to its core? And why, of all people, did Karen believe she had the right to decide who deserved to live freely and who didn't? The answers are far more shocking than you think. Ability, she grew up learning to adapt in a world that wasn't always patient. While other kids rushed through hallways, laughing and whispering secrets, Emily often struggled to keep up, missing cues, asking for repetitions, navigating a loneliness only she fully understood. Her parents, David and Grace Parker, were the kind of people who built their lives around her. David, a steady man with calloused hands from years of carpentry, had always promised Emily that she could do anything she set her mind to. Grace, once a teacher, had given up her career to help Emily manage therapies and endless appointments. Together, they formed a fortress around their daughter, shielding her from a world that could be cruel. And Emily, she didn't want pity. What she wanted was independence. She wanted to show her family, her teachers, her community that she was more than a diagnosis. That's why she enrolled in a hospitality class at school, a program designed to teach students the art of service, communication, and presentation. For Emily, this wasn't just a class. It was her shot at a future. She dreamed of one day working in event planning or hotel management, turning her gift for detail into a career. To her, every assignment mattered. Every test was proof that she could stand on her own. But across the street lived someone who didn't see her determination, someone who didn't see her humanity at all. Karen Whitmore, a woman whose very name made neighbors stiffen. She was the president of the Maplewood Homeowners Association, a position she treated less like a duty and more like a throne. With her manicured nails, sharp suits, and a permanent scowl etched onto her face, she prowled the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff. Grass an inch too high? Violation. Cars parked facing the wrong direction? Fine. Children laughing too loudly in the yard? Warning. To outsiders, Karen looked like a woman in control. To those who lived under her rule, she was a storm waiting to break. What made her dangerous wasn't just her obsession with rules. It was her obsession with control. Karen didn't tolerate defiance. She thrived on the fear she instilled in her neighbors. And for reasons no one could quite explain, she seemed to reserve her sharpest cruelty for the Parkers. Some whispered it was jealousy. Others thought she resented the way David and Grace ignored her petty threats. But for Emily, it was something far simpler. She represented everything Karen couldn't stand: hope, innocence, persistence in the face of struggle. Their first real clash happened months before the shooting. Emily had been practicing her hospitality routine, carrying a tray with glasses, greeting an imaginary guest, rehearsing her lines. To Karen, it looked like playing in the common area, and she snapped, accusing Emily of jumping on the sidewalk. Her words were venomous, sharp enough to slice through the warm afternoon. Emily, embarrassed, gathered her things and retreated inside, cheeks burning. Her parents brushed it off at first. "She's just bitter," David muttered. Grace tried to soothe Emily's hurt feelings, reminding her that some people lash out because they're unhappy with themselves. But even then, even in that small moment, the shadow of something darker lingered in the air. Karen wasn't just annoyed. She was fixated, and the neighborhood knew it. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about her temper. Some remembered the time she nearly came to blows with a father whose child left a bicycle in the cul-de-sac. Others recalled the day she stood in the rain, clipboard in hand, documenting violations while everyone else rushed indoors. She had turned the HOA into a weapon, and she wielded it with precision. For the Parkers, it became a game of endurance. Fines appeared in the mailbox. Anonymous complaints were filed against them for improper landscaping or noise disturbances. And yet, despite it all, Emily kept practicing. Her teacher, Mrs. Delgado, often praised her for her determination. "You have a gift, Emily," she told her one afternoon. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Your kindness is your strength." Those words became Emily's anchor. Still, every step on that sidewalk felt like an act of rebellion against Karen's invisible rulebook. Every practice session risked another confrontation. And though no one said it aloud, the Parkers began to feel the weight of something pressing down on them, like the quiet hum of electricity before a storm. Because when someone like Karen fixates on you, it isn't a question of if something will happen. It's a question of when. And for Emily Parker, that when was closer than anyone dared to imagine. It started on a golden afternoon when the sidewalks shimmered under the late spring sun. Emily Parker stood in front of her house, balancing a small silver tray with 3 glasses of water. Her teacher had given her an assignment: demonstrate the process of welcoming and serving a guest with confidence. For most students, it was simple: For Emily, it was monumental. She adjusted her notebook tucked under her arm, murmuring the lines she had practiced all week. "Good afternoon, welcome. May I take your coat? Please follow me inside." Her words were clear, measured, practiced until they flowed with ease. Grace watched proudly from the porch, her heart swelling. For the first time, Emily didn't look like a girl defined by her disability. She looked like a professional in the making. David snapped a picture with his phone, capturing the glow of determination in his daughter's eyes. But across the street, behind the slats of a half-drawn curtain, another pair of eyes were locked on Emily, cold, unblinking, predatory. Karen Whitmore. She didn't see a girl chasing her dream. She saw a violation, a child defying her authority, using her sidewalk like a personal playground. And Karen was not the kind of woman who allowed defiance to go unanswered. The door of her house slammed open, the sound ricocheting down the street like a warning shot. Neighbors on porches turned their heads, already bracing for the storm. Karen's heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she marched across the road, clipboard in hand, her mouth pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice slicing through the air. "What exactly do you think you're doing out here?" Emily froze, the tray wobbling in her hands. Grace stepped forward instinctively, but Karen's eyes were locked on the teenager. I'm practicing," Emily said softly, clutching the tray tighter. "Practicing." Karen's laugh was bitter, sharp. "On my sidewalk? Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? Jumping around like that, blocking public access?" David rose from the porch, jaw tightening. "She wasn't jumping, Karen. She's working on a school assignment." But Karen wasn't listening. She never listened. Her voice grew louder, drawing more neighbors to their windows. "This is exactly the problem with your family. No respect for rules, no respect for this community. And you," she stabbed her finger toward Emily, "you don't get to treat this neighborhood like your personal stage." Emily's cheeks burned crimson. Her hands shook. The tray clattered as one of the glasses tipped and splashed water down her shirt. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears she refused to let Karen see. Grace rushed to her daughter's side, wrapping an arm protectively around her shoulders. "That's enough, Karen," she said, her voice steady but shaking underneath. "She's a child. She's doing her schoolwork. You need to go back inside." But Karen stepped closer, her shadow falling over them. "A child? She's a nuisance. And if you don't control her, then I will. Mark my words, this is your final warning." David's fists clenched at his sides. His instincts screamed to fight back, to shout her down in front of everyone. But he saw Emily's trembling lip, saw her eyes darting between him and Karen, begging silently for safety. And so, with all the restraint he could muster, he said, "If you have a problem, file your complaint like you always do. But you will not harass my daughter again." For a moment, the air between them thickened with something almost tangible, as though the entire street was holding its breath. Karen's eyes narrowed into slits, and a cruel smile curled at the edges of her lips. "Oh, I will file it," she hissed. "And next time, you'll wish it had stopped at paperwork." She turned sharply, her heels striking the pavement like gunshots of their own, and stormed back into her house. The slam of her front door echoed across the block, leaving the Parkers standing in stunned silence. Emily set the tray down on the porch rail, her small shoulders sagging. "I just wanted to do well," she whispered, her voice breaking. Grace kissed her hair, holding her close, while David looked toward Karen's house, his jaw tight, his heart heavy with dread. Because this wasn't just an angry neighbor's tantrum. This was a threat, and though they tried to brush it off that evening, telling Emily she'd done wonderfully, reassuring her that bullies only win if you give them power, both parents knew something had shifted. Karen had crossed a line, and once she crossed a line, she never went back. What they didn't see, what no one saw, was the figure of Karen that night in her living room. She sat at her desk, flipping open a leather-bound binder stuffed with HOA policies, scribbling notes with a furious hand. Beside her chair, almost hidden in the shadows, sat a locked box. She glanced at it briefly, her expression darkening, before muttering under her breath. If they don't learn to obey the rules, then I'll make sure they never forget who's in charge. And with that, the war had begun. The days that followed the confrontation left a heaviness in the Parker household. The sunlight still poured across Maplewood Lane, children still biked along the cul-de-sac, and sprinklers still ticked rhythmically on manicured lawns. But for Emily and her parents, the air itself felt different, thicker, edged with unease. Every time they stepped outside, it was impossible to shake the feeling of eyes watching them from across the street. Karen had retreated, yes, but she had not disappeared. And in many ways, her silence was worse than her shouting. The first sign came 3 days later when David opened their mailbox. Inside was an official-looking envelope stamped with the HOA seal. He tore it open, half expecting another ridiculous fine about their grass. Instead, he found a notice typed in bold, unforgiving letters: violation, unsafe use of common areas. The document went on to accuse the Parkers of allowing Emily to engage in reckless physical behavior on community sidewalks, endangering neighbors, and setting a dangerous precedent. The penalty was $250, due immediately. David's hands trembled as he read. Grace snatched the paper from him, scanning it quickly. "This is insane," she whispered. "She's punishing Emily for doing her homework." Emily, sitting at the kitchen table with her exam notes spread before her, looked up anxiously. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Grace said firmly, kneeling beside her. "You did nothing wrong. This isn't about you. It's about her." But reassurance couldn't erase the unease that spread through the house like a stain. Soon after came the whispers. A neighbor mentioned overhearing Karen telling people at the HOA meeting that Emily was a problem child, a disruption, even a potential danger. The words cut deep, not just because they were lies, but because they carried weight. In a neighborhood where Karen controlled the narrative, rumors became truths faster than facts ever could. And then came the shadows. Late one night, as David reviewed blueprints at his desk, the doorbell camera pinged. He glanced at his phone and froze. A figure loomed at the edge of the porch, just beyond the frame of clarity. The person never rang the bell, never knocked, just stood there, lingering, before vanishing into the dark. The following morning, they found another envelope. This one wasn't official, no HOA stamp, no typed letterhead. Just a single sheet of paper with blocky handwriting. "Keep her OFF the sidewalk, or next time IT won't just be a fine." Grace's hands shook as she read the note. Emily, seeing her mother pale, asked what was wrong. They told her it was nothing, just junk mail. But Emily wasn't naive. She saw the way her parents exchanged looks, the way David quietly checked the locks twice that night, the way Grace jumped at every creak of the house. And still, Emily practiced, because despite the fear, despite the threats, she knew what was at stake. This exam wasn't just a grade, it was proof of her independence. She wanted to show her teacher, her classmates, her parents, and herself that she could succeed. And so, each afternoon, she stepped onto that sidewalk, tray in hand, words rehearsed under her breath. And each afternoon, Karen's curtain twitched. The neighborhood began to fracture. Some whispered support for the Parkers, but few dared to say it aloud. One family across the street avoided eye contact altogether, fearful of being targeted next. Another muttered apologies in passing, but never raised their voice in meetings. Only one person, Mrs. Delgado, the same teacher guiding Emily through her hospitality course, had the courage to speak up. She visited one evening, her arms full of supplies, practice trays, mock menus, even a small bell. "Emily," she said gently, "I know things are hard right now, but don't let anyone steal your progress. You're one of my best students." Emily's eyes brightened. "Really? Really?" Mrs. Delgado smiled. "And I'll back you every step of the way." But even as the teacher spoke words of encouragement, David noticed headlights slowing outside their house, lingering longer than normal. A car idled at the corner, engine purring softly, before rolling away into the night. He didn't tell Grace. He didn't tell Emily. But he knew. Someone was watching. The tension reached its breaking point at the next HOA meeting. David attended reluctantly, knowing Karen would be there. The room was crowded with homeowners, the smell of coffee and paper mingling with a low murmur of voices. Karen presided at the front, clipboard in hand, her expression cool and triumphant. Halfway through the agenda, she raised Emily's violations as an item of business. She spoke with rehearsed authority, painting a picture of a reckless teenager endangering the neighborhood, ignoring rules, disrespecting boundaries. Murmurs spread. David stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "That's my daughter you're slandering. She wasn't reckless, she was practicing for school, and you know it." Karen's eyes gleamed. "Then perhaps she should practice indoors where she can't disrupt the rest of us." "She's 16 years old," David snapped. "She deserves the same space as every other kid in this neighborhood. And you," his voice trembled with barely restrained anger, "you need to stop harassing her." Karen leaned back, her smile thin and chilling. "Consider this your last warning, Mr. Parker. If you won't control her, the board will." Gasps rippled through the room. A few neighbors glanced at each other uneasily, but no one spoke up. Karen had made her threat in public, and yet no one dared to challenge her. That night, Grace whispered to David in the dark, "She's not going to stop, is she?" "No," he admitted, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of their house. "She's just getting started." What neither of them saw, what none of the neighbors realized, was Karen back in her house, pacing with restless fury. She opened her handbag, pulling out a small handgun. She held it up to the lamplight, running her manicured thumb along the cold steel. And in that moment, her words from earlier echoed like a prophecy. "If you won't control her, the board will." Only now, the board wasn't what she had in mind. The Parker family had lived with tension for weeks, but nothing could have prepared them for the afternoon when everything finally boiled over. It was a Saturday, warm and bright, the kind of day when children should have been playing in yards and neighbors barbecuing on porches. Emily had convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, things were settling down. She gathered her tray, her notebook, and a small bell her teacher had given her. Today's practice would be short, just enough to refine the graceful movements she had memorized. "Remember, sweetheart," Grace said as she adjusted her daughter's collar. Eye contact, steady hands, and a smile. Emily grinned. "I've got this." David watched from the steps, forcing himself to relax. For weeks he'd been on edge, scanning every shadow, every car that lingered too long. But today he told himself to let her be, to let her have her moment. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, the tray balanced perfectly in her hand, the bell resting beside the glasses. She walked 3 steps, paused, turned, bowed slightly as though welcoming an invisible guest. Her words were soft but confident. "Good evening, welcome. Please, right this way." For a fleeting second, the world felt normal again, until the sound of a door slamming shattered it. Karen stormed out of her house like a thundercloud breaking loose, her heels hammering against the pavement. Neighbors froze, some slipping back behind curtains, others lingering in quiet dread. Everyone knew what was about to happen. "Are you kidding me?" Karen's voice cracked across the street. "I warned you, didn't I? I told you this was your last chance." Emily stiffened, clutching her tray, her pulse racing. Grace hurried forward, placing herself between her daughter and the advancing figure. "She's practicing, Karen," Grace said firmly. "It's for school. You can't keep harassing her like this." Karen's face twisted, her eyes wild. "Practicing? Practicing? Do you people think the rules don't apply to you? That sidewalk is for walking, not for your circus act." Emily's lips quivered, but she stood her ground. "I'm not doing anything wrong." That only enraged Karen further. She closed the distance in seconds, shoving past Grace. Before anyone could react, her hand shot out and struck the tray from Emily's grasp. The glasses crashed to the ground, shattering, water spilling across the pavement. Emily stumbled back, but Karen didn't stop. She shoved her hard. The girl's small body toppled, her arm catching the concrete at an unnatural angle. A sickening crack followed. Emily screamed in agony, clutching her wrist as tears poured down her face. "Stop!" Grace shouted, lunging forward. She shoved Karen back with all the strength panic could muster. "You hurt her." David bolted from the porch, his face red with fury. He scooped Emily into his arms, her sobs muffled against his chest, and turned on Karen with fire in his eyes. "If you ever touch my daughter again," Karen smirked. "Or what? Call the police? Go ahead. Let's see who they believe, your rule-breaking brat or me?" The cruelty in her tone was enough to still the air. Neighbors watched from porches, horrified but paralyzed, too afraid to intervene. David didn't waste another second. He carried Emily to the car, Grace at his side, and sped toward the hospital. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Doctors swarmed Emily, gently examining her swollen wrist, murmuring words like fracture and cast. Grace clutched her daughter's other hand, whispering comfort through her own tears. David paced the hall, fists clenched, heart hammering. Every time the door opened, he hoped for answers, for reassurance. But the rage inside him burned hotter than his fear. He replayed the image again and again, Karen's hand shoving Emily, his daughter, scream. When the police finally arrived, David's hope flared. Maybe, finally, Karen would face consequences, but the officer's expression was flat, dismissive. "We've spoken to Ms. Whitmore," he said. "She claims your daughter was obstructing the sidewalk and became aggressive when asked to move." David stared at him, incredulous. "Aggressive? She's 16. She weighs 100 pounds. The officer shrugged. "It's one neighbor's word against another's. No witnesses willing to sign statements. Best we can do is file a report." Grace's voice broke. "She broke our daughter's arm. How is that nothing?" The officer sighed. "Ma'am, unless we have clear evidence, there's not much we can pursue. I'd recommend avoiding further conflict with Ms. Whitmore." Avoiding conflict. The words felt like a death sentence. That night, as Emily slept with her arm in a cast, Grace sat at her bedside, stroking her hair. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. David stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street. Across the way, Karen's house glowed faintly. He could almost see her silhouette in the window. Calm, collected, untouchable. "She's not going to stop," Grace whispered. "No," David said, his voice low, heavy with resolve. "She's just getting started." And though he didn't say it aloud, his gut told him the truth. If the system wouldn't protect them, if neighbors wouldn't stand up, then next time wouldn't be just a broken arm. Karen had already crossed the line, and lines like that don't get uncrossed. The sun had just begun to dip toward the horizon when Emily decided she couldn't wait any longer. Her final hospitality exam was only a few days away, and after weeks of practice, missed sessions, and one broken arm still stiff in a cast, she refused to let fear steal her chance. Grace pleaded softly, "Maybe practice tomorrow, sweetheart. You've been through enough." But Emily shook her head, determination etched into her young face. "If I don't practice, I'll fail. I need to do this for me." David wanted to protest, but something in her voice silenced him. He had built his life on protecting her, but he also knew he couldn't shield her forever. So he kissed her forehead, helped her adjust the sling holding her fractured arm, and whispered, "Okay, we'll be right here." Emily stepped out onto the sidewalk, her exam papers clutched in her good hand. The evening was quiet, too quiet. Cicadas hummed faintly in the distance, and somewhere a dog barked. But the street itself felt like it was holding its breath. She took a deep inhale, squared her shoulders, and began her routine. "Good evening, welcome," she said, her voice calm, steady. She gestured gracefully with her notebook. "Allow me to take you inside." Her parents watched from the porch, pride and worry braided together in their expressions. To them, this was more than practice, it was defiance. Proof that no matter how much Karen threatened, she couldn't take Emily's dream away. But across the street, a curtain shifted. Karen had been watching. She always watched. The front door opened slowly, and for a moment she lingered in the frame, her figure outlined in the fading light. Then, like a predator stepping into the open, she emerged. No clipboard this time. No pen. Only her, walking briskly, one hand buried inside her handbag. Not again, Grace whispered, her stomach twisting. David rose from the porch, his voice booming across the street. Karen, enough. Leave her alone. But Karen ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Emily, burning with fury. I told you, girl, she spat, her voice carrying down the block. I told you this was the last time. Emily froze, notebook trembling in her hand. I'm just practicing. Karen's laugh was cold, sharp. No, you're mocking me. You're disrespecting me. And I won't stand for it. Neighbors peeked through windows, doors cracked open, faces pale as they sensed what was about to happen. But no one moved. Karen's hand slipped from her bag, and with it came the gleam of cold steel. The world slowed. Grace screamed, "No!" David lunged forward. Emily's eyes widened, her mouth opening in shock, her body frozen where she stood. The gun fired. The sound ripped through the neighborhood, louder than thunder, sharper than breaking glass. Birds scattered from rooftops, dogs howled, children cried out from their yards. Emily staggered backward, the notebook slipping from her grasp, fluttering to the ground. A dark bloom spread across her shirt, staining the white fabric deep crimson. She gasped, her knees buckling, her small frame crumpling onto the pavement. The world seemed to tilt with her, collapsing into chaos. Grace's scream tore through the air as she sprinted toward her daughter. David was already there, dropping to his knees, scooping Emily into his arms. Stay with me, baby, stay with me, he begged, his voice raw with desperation. Emily's lips trembled, blood staining the corner of her mouth. Dad, she whispered, so faintly it was almost lost in the wails of panic around them. Her good hand clutched his shirt weakly before slipping. Grace pressed trembling hands against the wound, sobbing, "Hold on, sweetheart, hold on." Her cries echoed through the block, searing themselves into the memory of every silent witness watching from behind glass. And Karen? She stood there, gun in hand, her face cold and unyielding. I warned you, she said, her tone almost casual. I told you this would happen. Gasps rippled through the neighborhood. Some neighbors screamed. Others pulled out their phones, fumbling to dial 911. But no one could erase what had already been done. The wail of sirens finally broke the paralysis. Red and blue lights bathed the street as police cars screeched to a halt, paramedics rushing past, shouting orders, lifting Emily onto a stretcher. Her blood stained their gloves as they worked frantically, voices clipped and urgent. BP dropping. Prep 4. We're losing her. Grace tried to climb into the ambulance, sobbing uncontrollably, while David stood frozen, his hands covered in his daughter's blood. His heart hammered with rage and helplessness, his eyes burning into Karen's. She lowered the gun slowly, finally handing it to an officer with a smug little shrug. Self-defense, she muttered. She lunged at me. They all saw it. The audacity left the crowd in stunned disbelief. Self-defense? Against a teenage girl holding a notebook? But the words were out there, and Karen said them with such conviction that a few neighbors, terrified of her wrath, remained silent. The ambulance doors slammed shut. The siren wailed, carrying Emily away into the night. And in the heavy silence that followed, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer a petty feud, no longer a matter of fines or warnings. This was war. And for the Parker family, it had just turned into a fight for their daughter's life. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, their sterile glow casting everything in harsh relief. Grace sat hunched in a hard plastic chair, her hands trembling, her clothes stiff with dried blood that wasn't her own. David paced the corridor like a caged animal, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles had gone bone white. Behind the heavy double doors, Emily lay hooked to machines, her frail chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, each one sounding like a prayer fighting against time. Nurses moved quickly, monitors beeped in erratic rhythms, and the surgeons' hushed voices slipped through the crack in the door like fragments of a storm. Why isn't anyone telling us anything? David barked at the nurse's station, his voice breaking under the strain. "That's my daughter in there. She was shot in cold blood." The nurse swallowed hard, her eyes full of pity. "Sir, please, the doctors are doing everything they can. You'll be updated soon." But soon felt like hours. Every tick of the clock stretched, every creak of the hospital's old pipes felt like a cruel reminder of what they could lose. Grace whispered through tears, "She's just a child. She didn't deserve this." She was practicing for an exam, David, an exam. Her words struck like knives because they weren't just grief, they were guilt. David felt it gnawing at him, too. He had let her go outside. He had told her, "We'll be right here." But when the moment came, his strength hadn't been enough. Finally, a doctor emerged, his scrub stained, his mask pulled low on his chin. His eyes gave the answer before his mouth did, exhausted, heavy, uncertain. "She's stable," he said at last. "For now." Grace collapsed into David's arms, sobbing in relief. But the doctor wasn't finished. The bullet shattered part of her shoulder and caused significant internal bleeding. She lost a dangerous amount of blood before arriving here. The next 48 hours are critical. If there are no complications, she'll have a chance, but her recovery will be long. Very long. David nodded, swallowing hard. "Do whatever it takes. Please, spare no expense." When they were finally allowed inside, the sight nearly broke them. Emily looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, pale against the stark white sheets, tubes snaking from her arms, machines clicking with every heartbeat. She stirred faintly, whispering through cracked lips, "Did I pass?" Grace bent down, tears streaming, and kissed her forehead. "You're the bravest girl in the world. You've already passed." But as fragile hope flickered in that hospital room, darkness was brewing outside. Back in the neighborhood, Karen's narrative had already begun to spread. "I had no choice," she told officers calmly, standing in her front yard as flashing lights painted her face. "The girl lunged at me. She was aggressive. You saw the cast. Maybe she was unstable, maybe she lost balance. I thought she was going to attack me." Some neighbors murmured uneasily, shifting on their porches. They had seen what happened, Emily holding nothing but a notebook, but fear kept their mouths shut. Karen had intimidated them for years with citations, fines, and threats. Now, with a gun in the picture, silence felt like survival. When detectives pressed her further, Karen stuck to her lie. Self-defense, she repeated coolly. It was her, or me. To the Parkers' horror, Karen wasn't arrested that night. The officers cited conflicting witness statements and ongoing investigation. Watching from the hospital, David nearly tore the TV off the wall as the local news played Karen's version of the story on repeat. "She shot my daughter, and she's sleeping in her own bed tonight?" David shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "What kind of justice system is this?" Grace clutched his arm, trembling. "We can't lose control. If we fight smart, we'll win. But if we let her twist this, if we let her own the narrative, we'll lose Emily all over again." So they began documenting everything. Every HOA notice, every voicemail, every neighbor who had quietly complained but never dared speak up. Slowly, whispers turned into testimony. Quietly at first, emails sent late at night, anonymous letters slid under doors, but soon patterns emerged. Karen's reign of control wasn't just about Emily. It was about everyone. The Parkers hired a lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Hughes, known in town for her relentless pursuit of truth. She sat across from David and Grace in the hospital cafeteria, her voice steady, her eyes burning with conviction. "Here's what we're up against," she said, flipping through Karen's statement. "She's claiming self-defense. No weapon was found on your daughter, but Karen has influence. HOA board members, police chiefs, even the mayor's office, they've all dealt with her for years. She knows how to manipulate authority." David slammed his fist against the table. "She manipulated them into letting her shoot a disabled child on a sidewalk. How do we fight that?" Rebecca leaned forward. "With facts, with witnesses, with pressure. But most of all, with visibility. If we keep this quiet, she wins." If we make noise, if we force the world to see her for what she is, she crumbles. Bullies always do when the lights are on them. And so, the Parkers prepared not just for a legal battle, but for war in the court of public opinion. Grace posted Emily's story online, sharing pictures of her in the hospital, tubes, and machines surrounding her fragile body. The post went viral overnight, thousands of comments flooding in outrage, prayers, donations. Hashtags spread across social media. Hashtag Justice for Emily. For the first time, Karen felt the weight of exposure. She tried to counter, calling the Parkers liars and attention seekers, but her words fell flat against the tidal wave of support pouring in for Emily. Meanwhile, Emily fought on in the hospital. Each day was a victory, each breath a reminder that Karen hadn't taken everything. But the scars, physical and emotional, were deep, and the path ahead stretched longer than anyone wanted to admit. Still, as David sat by her bedside one night, holding her hand while machines hummed softly, he whispered a vow. They think this is over. But it's not. I swear to you, Emmy, I'll tear down every lie she's built. I'll fight until the world knows the truth. And I will never, ever let her hurt you again. The words were quiet, but in them lived the fire that would carry them into the next battle. Because for the Parker family, survival wasn't enough anymore. Now it was about justice. The courthouse was packed. Every pew creaked under the weight of spectators, neighbors, reporters, strangers who had traveled miles after seeing Emily's story go viral. Camera flashes exploded outside, catching glimpses of Grace guiding Emily, still weak, her arm in a sling through the throng. David walked beside them, jaw set, shielding his daughter from the chaos. On the other side, Karen entered with calculated composure. Her hair was perfect, her suit crisp, her smile thin and practiced. She waved faintly to a cluster of HOA board members who had dared to show up, as if this were just another neighborhood meeting she was presiding over. When she took her seat at the defense table, her eyes flicked toward the Parkers. The smirk she gave them wasn't one of fear. It was the smirk of someone who had manipulated systems before and expected to do it again. But this time, the world was watching. The judge entered. The gavel struck wood, echoing through the chamber. Court is now in session. The People versus Karen Douglas. The prosecution began by laying bare the facts. A disabled teenager, unarmed, shot on a neighborhood sidewalk while preparing for a school exam. Photographs of Emily's blood-stained notebook were projected on a large screen. The jurors leaned forward, grimacing at the images. Gasps rippled through the gallery when a nurse testified to the extent of Emily's injuries. Rebecca Hughes, the Parkers' attorney, delivered her opening statement with steady fire. She painted Karen not as a frightened woman acting in self-defense, but as a long-time aggressor, a tyrant who had weaponized her position of power, escalating until her obsession with control ended in violence. She did not fire that gun out of fear, Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the stillness. She fired it out of rage, out of entitlement, out of a belief that she was untouchable. Karen's attorney countered with the same script Karen had rehearsed from day one, self-defense. My client feared for her life, he told the jury. The girl was erratic, unstable. My client had no way of knowing what she might do. The Parkers clenched their fists under the table. The lie felt like acid. Witnesses were called. Neighbors, shaky at first, described years of intimidation. One by one, they admitted to citations for trivial things: a flower bed too wide, a recycling bin left out for an extra hour, children's chalk drawings scrubbed from sidewalks under threat of fines. She loved control, one elderly man testified. She thrived on it, and if you resisted even a little, she'd make your life hell. When asked why they hadn't spoken sooner, silence fell heavy. Finally, a woman's voice broke. Because we were scared. She had power over us. But after what she did to that child, enough is enough. Karen's mask faltered for the first time, her lips tightening, eyes flashing as whispers rolled through the courtroom. Then came the most harrowing testimony, Emily herself. Grace wheeled her to the stand, helping her up the small steps with trembling hands. The courtroom held its breath as Emily raised her good hand to swear the oath. She was pale, fragile, but when she began to speak, her voice carried a strength no one expected. "I wasn't attacking her," she said, her eyes fixed on the jurors. "I was studying. I was practicing for my exam. I wasn't holding anything but my notebook." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't falter. "When she pointed the gun at me, I thought it was a joke. I thought nobody would actually shoot a kid. But then, I heard the bang, and I felt my chest burn. And I fell. And I thought I'd never see my mom and dad again." The courtroom went silent, except for the sound of muffled sobs in the gallery. Even the judge's stern face softened. Karen shifted in her seat, eyes darting nervously. For the first time, she seemed small, not untouchable, not invincible, just a woman whose lies were crumbling under the weight of truth. Then Rebecca made her move. "Ms. Douglas," she said, turning sharply toward Karen, "you claim you feared for your life. Tell us, what exactly was Emily holding?" Karen's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Karen swallowed. I thought it was something heavy, maybe a weapon." Rebecca held up the evidence bag, the blood-stained spiral notebook. She placed it on the witness stand in front of Emily. This is what you mistook for a weapon?" The jurors leaned in, eyes narrowing. Karen stammered. It could have been anything," Rebecca cut her off. "No, Ms. Douglas. It could only have been what it was. A notebook, paper and ink. And you knew that. You weren't afraid. You were angry. Angry that you couldn't control her. Angry that this family refused to bow to your tyranny. Isn't that the truth?" Karen's face flushed. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But no words came out. The silence was deafening. In closing arguments, Rebecca's words struck like thunder. Emily Parker nearly lost her life because one woman decided her authority mattered more than a child's future. If you let Karen Douglas walk free today, you tell every bully, every abuser of power that the rules bend to them. But if you hold her accountable, you tell Emily and every child like her that justice is still alive. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they filed back in, the air was electric. David's hands gripped Grace's. Emily held her mother's arm, her small fingers digging in as if bracing for impact. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." Gasps erupted. Karen's face went pale. She shook her head in disbelief as the gavel struck again. The judge's voice was firm. "Karen Douglas, you are hereby remanded into custody to await sentencing." As bailiffs moved in, Karen rose, shouting desperately, "This isn't justice. This is a witch hunt. You'll regret this." But her words were drowned out by applause. The gallery rose to its feet, not in celebration, but in vindication. Justice had spoken. That night, back at home, Emily sat between her parents on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She was still fragile, still in pain, but her eyes were brighter than they'd been in weeks. "Did we win?" she asked softly. David kissed her forehead. "We did, sweetheart. We finally won." Grace whispered, "And we'll never let anyone take your voice away again." Outside, neighbors left flowers on their porch, candles flickering in silent solidarity. The Parker family wasn't just free of Karen. They had reclaimed their home, their dignity, their future. And though Emily's scars would remain, they were no longer symbols of fear. They were proof of survival, proof that even in the shadow of cruelty, light could break through. Weeks passed. The frenzy of the trial faded, the cameras moved on, and life in Willow Creek slowly began to settle. But inside the Parker home, healing was still a daily battle. Emily's body mended in pieces. The bullet wound left a jagged scar across her chest, a scar she stared at in the mirror some mornings with a silence that broke Grace's heart. Physical therapy was grueling, each movement stiff and painful. But she pushed through, whispering to herself the same words her father had once told her. "Your spirit is stronger than any wound." At night, David often found her bent over her textbooks, her notebook, restored and cleaned, open in front of her. The bloodstains hadn't fully washed out, but Emily insisted on keeping it. "It reminds me that I didn't give up," she said. Grace, sitting beside her daughter one evening, asked, "Do you really want to keep it, sweetheart?" Emily's eyes glistened as she nodded. "Yes, because it shows I kept going even when it hurt. I want to see it every time I think I can't do something." Her words silenced both parents. In that moment, they realized Emily was no longer just their little girl. They were witnessing her becoming a fighter, a survivor in her own right. The neighborhood began to change too. Without Karen's shadow looming over every garden and sidewalk, families stepped outside again. Children rode bikes in the street. Neighbors waved across driveways without fear of being cited for uncut grass or a misaligned trash bin. The Parkers found themselves surrounded by an unexpected outpouring of support. Homemade casseroles appeared on their porch. Neighbors stopped by to check in, sometimes just to say, "We're glad Emily's okay." Even those who once avoided them out of fear now joined hands in solidarity. One afternoon, the HOA board gathered, this time without Karen. The vote was unanimous. Karen was permanently removed from her role, barred from holding any position of authority in the community again. A new charter was drafted, ensuring that no single person could ever wield unchecked power over neighbors again. It wasn't just a victory for the Parkers, it was a rebirth for Willow Creek. But the deepest transformation was within Emily herself. Months later, she stood in front of her class, trembling as she began her final presentation for the hospitality course. The room fell silent as she spoke, not about recipes or event planning, but about resilience. "I was preparing for this exam when my life almost ended," she told her classmates. "But what I've learned is that hospitality isn't just about serving meals or decorating spaces. It's about people. It's about kindness and community and standing by each other when things get hard. Without that, none of us can heal." Her teacher wiped tears from her eyes as the class erupted into applause. Emily smiled shyly, clutching her notebook, her voice finally steady again. On the anniversary of the shooting, the Parkers lit a single candle on their porch. They didn't speak much, words weren't needed. Emily sat between her parents, her small hand clasped in theirs, watching the flame flicker against the night. David broke the silence first. "She tried to silence you, Em. But here you are, stronger than ever. That's the real victory." Grace added softly, "And maybe someday when someone else feels powerless, your story will remind them they're not alone." Emily leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I hope so. If what I went through helps even one person keep fighting, then it wasn't for nothing." And so, the Parker family moved forward, not forgetting but choosing to rise. Their story was no longer about fear or control. It was about reclaiming power, about love that refused to break, and about a young girl whose courage turned tragedy into hope. Because in the end, scars do not only remind us of pain, they remind us of survival. If you've stayed with us through this journey, remember this. Real strength doesn't come from control or power. It comes from compassion, from standing up for what's right, and from never letting fear silence your truth. Emily's story is fictional, but the emotions, the struggles, the injustices are very real for so many families. Let her resilience remind you that even in the darkest moments, light can break through. And if you want more powerful stories that reveal the fight for justice, family, and hope, make sure you subscribe to the HOA stories, because sometimes the stories we tell aren't just entertainment. They're a reminder of what we're all capable of surviving.